What makes Pralaya Yoga different than other forms of yoga is, if you consider this as a given bone, and we put another bone, so we have a joint structure. So this is the surface of the joint, and when children are very young, usually the bones are balanced, and then after some period of time, because of stress, exercise, whatever, as they get older, as they become adults, then typically what happens is the joint will become a little tighter on one side because certain muscles are tight, and it will become a little freer on the other side, or a little more stretched out on the other side. If we consider that this is the skeletal structure of a person, then if their chest is collapsed forward, they're going to get very tight in the front of their chest, front of their spine, and the back of the spine will overstretch. Well, if this is in the lower spine, if I'm reaching over to pick up 2 suitcases or some kind of heavy object, what happens is the abdomen tightens and the lower back overstretches, and you could end up with a herniated disc. So the idea of the yoga is to bring the joints back into balance. In traditional yoga, it's not the only thing that's done in traditional yoga, but a very common approach is that if I have an imbalance at a joint where the muscles are very tight on one side and freer on the other side, or looser on the other side, then what is typically done is people try to stretch out the tight side. And, that can be a good approach under certain circumstances. It certainly works in someone living in a cave in India in a very hot environment. That might work out really well, just because of how their nervous system's functioning. They're a little more resigned to whatever's happening in their life. They have austere conditions, and so they've let go into those austere conditions. And they don't have quite as much stress in general. They've let go into the conditions they have. So if you try to stretch under those conditions, you find body's warmer, person's more relaxed, vegetarian diet, not too much to eat. Then stretching out the tight side is easier, because I stretch it out, and the next day it's not healed because there's not enough food maybe to heal the whole thing. But in the West, if they don't have a vegetarian diet and you have a very stressful individual, you'll find that if you stretch an area out, it'll tighten. The next day it's tight again. So a typical example of that is if I have an individual who has very tight neck and shoulders, and I try to stretch this out, or I try to massage this and free this area, what will happen is if they're very stressed, the shoulders will tend to come up as a result of that. There's an effect on digestive organs because they're stressed. Digestion may not be so good. Has an effect on strength of lats, latissimus dorsi. So the shoulder goes up and the neck stays tight. So if I'm only trying to relax and stretch out the muscles from my neck down to my shoulder, and I'm not strengthening the muscles that pull the shoulders down, then I can stretch this out. It'll be better for a few minutes, and then it'll tighten up again. So unless I strengthen the opposing muscle, it doesn't work. So what Pralaya Yoga does is we always look at what, in a given position, we always look at not which muscle do I want to stretch, but if I want to stretch a given muscle, how do I strengthen the opposing muscle? If I strengthen the opposing muscle, neurologically the tight muscle will let go. Within the nervous system that occurs. There's a reflex arc. So muscle tightens on one side, the other side lets go. The example we gave earlier was if I have my right leg extended out and I want to improve flexibility in forward bending, then I can either stretch out the hamstring or strengthen the quadricep. And so in the West, it works out much more effectively to strengthen the quadricep and get the hamstring to release. To strengthen, in this case, is very specific, to strengthen serratus anterior, to drag the shoulder blade down the back, to lift the rib cage up. Serratus does both of those things. And to drag the shoulder slightly forward so the length from neck to shoulder increases. So the way we would work in releasing the neck in Pralaya Yoga would be shoulder blade down, shoulder blade forward, chest arching up. And it gives you greatest length from base of skull to shoulder. So that's the approach. The approach is different. Again, if I look at a joint, if it's tight on one side, what kind of problem am I going to get on the tight side? Well, cartilage could wear out sooner. You might end up with osteoarthritis or a problem like that. Or if it's a knee, you might have a problem with a meniscus, some cushioning inside the knee. On the looser side, the freer side, you might get injury to a ligament, or that's a little bit more likely. You might also get a strain in some of the muscles here. So the idea is if I strengthen the relatively weaker side, then I decompress the tight side. So you find joint longevity will increase as a result of doing this. So whenever we're working with yoga poses, we're always trying to decompress the spine. We're trying to make the spine longer. Now, ordinarily, when people go into back bends to open up the front of the spine, why do we want to do a back bend? We do a back bend to open the chest, to open the lungs, to decompress areas that might be tight because of some emotional problem, because of some emotional pain in the chest. So very often when people become depressed, they tend to collapse their chest. If they get very tired, they tend to collapse their chest. And closing the front of the body is never helpful. Long term, it's never helpful. So you always want to, just at the beginning of our process in yoga, you always want the spine to be long in the front, where the head is balanced over the neck. Head and neck balanced over upper spine and lower spine. And this creates the optimum condition for functioning of heart, of lungs, longevity in the spine. And it minimizes pressure on the nerve supply, going not only to muscles, but going to organs. If I have pressure on the nerve supply, not only do I get pain, but I can get weakness and numbness, say in the legs. If it's in the lower spine, I'll get weakness and numbness in the legs. But what else could happen? Well, if I have too much compression, it can actually even have an effect on functioning of organs. Okay, if it gets to a more extreme stage. So we always want to open the front of the body. A simple way to avoid some of the problems that people have in back bending is to use 3 blocks, like so, and let the spine relax over this. So if I put my lower rib cage on the top of the blocks and I let my hips hang down, that's a good way to get some stretch in the spine. Now, where do I want to place the rib cage? My lowest ribs are here on the sides. There are also floating ribs, which are not attached to the vertebrae. So I want to make sure that when I put my back on these blocks, that we place the blocks higher than the floating ribs. So there's no pressure on floating ribs, because we don't want to displace those. We don't want to press them in. Okay? So what do? I take my fingers, touch down at the base of the ribs at the sides, take my thumb, run it roughly along the back, and it gives me an idea of where I might put the rib cage. Now, from rubbing my thumb across the lower back, it gives me a feeling knowledge of where those blocks should touch. So I position myself on the blocks, catch my fingers behind the head, and then as the hips sink down, and you can have your legs extended out, they don't have to be folded in. But notice, as I lean back, my abdomen begins to lengthen, and you can decompress the spine. So I had one student who within 1 month gained an inch in height. She had a very compressed spine, and as she was in this particular position, practicing twice a day for just 2 or 3 minutes every day, morning and evening, the spine let go. So you'll notice that as I'm in this position, the hips are not touching the ground. Hips are hanging down, and gradually you'll find the muscles in the spine will let go. It'll decompress the spine. It's a great way to decompress the spine if you have any kind of congenital defect in the spine, like spondylolisthesis. Then people like that can't do back bends where there's compression. It could damage the facet joint. This takes all the pressure off the disc and the facet joint. Now that I've been here for some period of time, hips are starting to drop down. So it gives you an idea of how to develop a back bend very safely. So that's the basic idea of how to work with aligning the joints so there's minimal pressure. What do we call alignment of the joint? When I create uniform pressure over the joint, one side is not tighter than the other, then what ends up happening? I'm less likely to get compression, injury to the cartilage, overstretching the soft tissue. Flexibility is more uniform in any direction, and the likelihood of injury in the joint is reduced if I have uniform pressure over the joint. The joint surface will last the longest if I do that. So that's the idea.